Welcome back, everybody. Today is All Day, 22nd of February. The chair of St. Peter. All right. We were finishing up a couple of weeks ago at our last class. We were finishing up the second part of the apologetics class, or the first book, which is on God. The second book was on religion, and we talked about the nature of religion, the supernatural revelation of religion, and I think we pretty much finished that. We did that the dogmas of the pronounced by the church are never new truths. They always come as a result of some truth being questioned, and therefore the church clarifies as to what that teaching actually is when she pronounces dogmas. And revelation of the necessary truths of the faith was definitely closed with the death of St. John the Apostle. But it's in the very nature of things that there should be occasional question about the content of that revelation, question of this or that point of doctrine as belonging or not belonging to that revelation. So while Holy Scripture and tradition constitute the sole source of revealed doctrine, the need for an authoritative interpreter, as we have seen, and this is the infallible Church of Christ with its infallible head. The rule of faith is a teaching of church divinely founded to show men infallibly the way of truth and salvation. So we're going to go to part 3 now, which is we've looked at God and God's existence and the proofs of that. We've looked at religion and the necessity. The third part that we go into now with regards to apologetics is Christ himself. Christ is the Redeemer, because we've seen that God has created, we've seen that man has fallen, we've seen that there is a necessity for religion. Now we see about the Redeemer. And so this becomes the integral part, or an integral part of Christ the Redeemer. Right, so let's go into remember what I talked about before is that when people start to attack religion, they attack often the scriptures themselves. By attacking the scriptures and bringing into question the authenticity of the scriptures, especially the early books of Genesis. And therefore, if you bring into question the book of Genesis, you question whether or not man actually fell. If man didn't fall, then there's no need for a redeemer, there's no need for Christianity, and therefore there's no need for this religion whatsoever. You question the book itself, the rest of it falls. So we're looking at Article 1 is the redemption. Article 1. Alright, so redemption, the meaning of the word is from the Latin re equals back, as in going back, and emere, the verb to buy. Okay, when one redeems something, one buys it back, going from the Latin. So it's quite simple how that works. Right, so redemption therefore is the act by which the God-man bought back for mankind the opportunity lost by original sin. So Christ himself redeems mankind by buying back man's opportunity. So So the act by which the God-man bought back for mankind the opportunity lost by original sin. That is the opportunity of attaining God and eternal happiness. Price paid for this purchase was the sufferings and death of the Redeemer. Thus he buys back for man the opportunity to be happy forever, paying the price. Okay, so the meaning of redemption. Well, that's A, basically the meaning of the redemption, Article 1A, the meaning, sorry about that, meaning of the word, and B, down here, is on the need of redemption. Right, so by original sin, man threw away his necessary opportunity. Achieving God in heaven, through the payment of an adequate price. So, therefore what? Through the payment of so that by reason of original sin, we can say that redemption is necessary. Okay, we're questioning here as to the necessity of redemption, or the need of redemption. Does the human race need to be redeemed? If original sin is real, then the answer is yes. By the reason of original sin, because man threw away his opportunity of achieving God in heaven, okay, and that's something that he was put to test with. He was in the Garden of Eden. He was in a naturally happy state. He was in the presence of God, although not fully knowledgeable of God, and that God had not exposed himself, but man therefore was in a state that God had created him for. He needed to pass a test, and then he would have revealed himself fully, and man would have been enjoying the fullness of heaven. And so man failed the test, and as a result of that failing the test, he threw away the necessary opportunity that he had. Okay, so God had given him this. It was there for the whole of the human race, and therefore achieving God in heaven was not possible because of original sin. So, through the payment of an adequate price, yes.
It's only just recently I was listening to a talk by Brad Petrie, I don't recall him, but anyway, it's just like a throwaway line. I always thought when they sinned and then God chucked them out, that was kind of a punishment, but it was actually more of a complete, absolute mercy. It
was very merciful,
if
yes.
If they had eaten the tree of life right then and there, they would have been stuck forever.
Living forever in original sin. So yes, it was a perfect sign of God's paternal love for his creatures to remove them from the Garden of Eden and block them from coming back in again. So yeah, that's absolutely true. So once man was in the Garden of Eden, and remember that Adam and Eve were created to not die, which is why they had these incredible physical stature or bodies that they were able to live for so many hundreds of years. And had they eaten of the tree of life, then they would for sure have just kept living and living and living. I mean, for someone to live 900 years plus, then we can only imagine it from our eyes of maximum 120, that when someone is 100 years old, they are ancient. You know, a small percentile of the human race have reached 3 figures since the fall, and they are in frail condition. They are very, very weak and very old. So how's somebody going to go at 120? There might be one person in the world who's 120 at any one given time, and they are right at the end of their life. But Adam and Eve are 900 years old, so somebody conceiving a child after their 40th year, the body is struggling to be able to conceive a child. So what are Adam and Eve going to do if Adam and Eve are created with the age of around 33? How many children are they able to have? They're only going to have a couple of children and that's it, but it's not possible. If they only had a couple of children and one killed the other, the human race wouldn't have gone anywhere. So there is no written history of how many children Adam and Eve have, but we can be sure that if they're living into their 9th century, then their bodies are really only starting to break down in the last 20 or 30 years, maybe 40 or 50 years. So you could say that up until 900 years, Adam and Eve are retaining their youth all the way through those first 900 years. That's a long marriage, isn't it? Probably had to have some counselling. Wow. Oh, I get people banging on my door and they've been married 2 years. So 902 years. Just jokes. Anyway, so yeah, lots and lots of children. Adam and Eve had many, many sets of children. We don't know how many. We're not going to know until we meet our Maker. But that having been said, they were created to live forever, and therefore living in the Garden of Eden, having fallen completely, the last thing that God wanted them to do was then eat of the tree of life. So it was necessary that they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and eventually their bodies, with now sin to have to deal with, and all the other parts of sin that they had to labour for their food, that their bodies would now come under a lot more pressure. So eventually they are going to die. It's going to take a long time for them to die, but God's showing his mercy. And there's plenty of penance being done by Adam and Eve in those next 900 years. You can imagine, I mean, they have been in God's presence. They've spoken to God. They have known what it was like to be perfect. And they saw what it was like the moment they fell, and they were horrified and ashamed and hid themselves from God. And so for that, the next 900 years, they're not going to forget that. It'll be impossible to, because their memories are so magnificent anyway. So they would have spent a lot of their time teaching their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. And you can just keep going on for 900. I don't know how many generations you get in 900 years. A lot, probably. I don't know.
40?
Yeah, 900 years, maybe even more. I mean, if they're that healthy, and have children fairly regularly, and the generations, I don't know how young they would be having it. I don't know, it's hard to say, probably
10.
5, 17,
Probably 14, 15, I'll be
yeah.
16.
It's a lot of great-greats. If you're a young kid and you go to school and you're meeting your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and he met God, you'd start saying, yeah, sure, you have me on. Anyway, so the need for redemption then, so because of original sin. And so Adam and Eve are seeing the results of original sin in themselves, but specifically in Cain and Abel immediately. I mean, murder is being committed. As soon as these boys have grown, one has murdered the other. And so their pain in seeing one of their own children murdering another would be also as painful as the fact that they recognise they are the origin of that original sin that has led to the death of one of their children. Yes?
So Father, from the beginning of creation, God used suffering as a source of bringing his people back to him.
Your question has one small error in it. Anybody know what that small error is?
Not from the beginning, from the fall.
It's not from the beginning of creation, it's from the fall.
Because if God is omniscient, he knows everything from creation. He would have known that Adam and Eve
Will fall.
and which is why he never, why they never saw his face in the garden, because he knew that they were going to commit that sin.
Yes, correct.
So,
But suffering is not used by God until the fall. There's no suffering prior to the fall. So that's just correcting that, like the way in which you chronologically put the question. Since the beginning of time or creation, God used suffering, but he didn't use suffering until the fall. It's a short distance.
so suffering is because of free will.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's because of the fall, and the fall is because of man's free will choosing the wrong thing. And so, as a result of that, but I think the general idea that you're putting on there is God's omniscience, that God knows all things from all time. God knows that man's going to fall, but he still provides man with the free will to make the right decision. And God even gives the grace for man to give the right decision. But same as us, we still make the wrong decision, even though God gives us the grace. And as a result of this, sufferings are going to enter into the world. And as a result of that, sufferings ought or can help us to find the right answers. But some people reject the sufferings, don't they? They run away from the sufferings. In fact, they use their sufferings as an example as to why not to believe in God, which is the opposite effect of what they are meant to do. But this is what happens when we choose to turn our backs on truth, the truth which is within us. Okay, so the world, obviously, the modern world is doing its best to reject God utterly. And one of their excuses is that there is suffering in the world.
It's probably easier to understand it from a Christian perspective, from an atheistic perspective.
Yes.
You can understand that, why they might think like they do.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, they themselves probably would find that harder to fathom. But that having been said, humility is a necessary part of finding the truth. For everybody, whether or not they are religious or not, you could be utterly atheistic, you could be utterly pagan. Humility still is the overcoming of one's self-importance, the overcoming of one's pride. You know, I don't know everything, and even the smartest person in the world knows they don't know everything, and therefore they've got to have some humility to be able to recognize, I do not know. In the face of overwhelming facts, everything around you can be known, but I don't know everything around me, and so therefore I don't know it all. And since I don't know it all and nobody does, then we ought to humble ourselves. I think it's just one of these things that makes a better society, is that when people show humility. When people don't show humility, pride rears its ugly face, and we end up in a vicious society. And I think this is philosophically where the ancient Greeks and Latins were trying to aim their society. In a philosophical sense, without it being religious, that the ancient Greeks and Latins were trying to produce societies that put virtue at the height of what they were aiming to do. Did they get there? In the end, no, but they definitely put it down as something that was worthy of pursuing as a society, and they ultimately failed because Christ was not part of those societies as such. But this is, I think, one of the main themes in all of Christianity, is that we must humble ourselves, and therefore we must pursue virtue and turn our back on vice, but we have to look critically upon ourselves. And philosophically speaking, this makes sense. And then when you add on to that grace, and when you add on to that the Redeemer himself, and see the way that he lived, then there is a great recognition in each and every one of us that we need to be humble and humbled, because it's hard to humble oneself. Does that make sense? A little bit off track there, but does it come back to what your question was?
And the payment of an adequate price. So our redemption is or was necessary?
Or our redemption was necessary. Yes, because as a fallen race, it was impossible for us to pay the price.
And impossible for anything or anyone else to pay for that except for, and that's the very reason why I write this word this way, okay? Rather than just saying the God or the man. I said the God-man, because only the God-man could pay the price, which was an infinite price. Remember the example I used a few weeks ago, that if you break something, then the person offended or the thing that is broken is going to judge how big the cost of it all is. So if one is to yell at one's sibling over a squabble over a pen or something like that, then the insult given might seem large to the sibling, but it's not that large. But if one is to argue and squabble over the ruler of a country or the ruler of a people or something like that, then the insult is greater, because the standing of the person that one has insulted has been so much greater. But when the person insulted is the creator of all, the one who has given all, the one who has shown only beneficence by giving life, by giving opportunity to be happy, by giving nothing but love, and even creating us, then the insult becomes infinite. Okay, because God has offered mankind eternity of happiness. Adam and Eve had it rolled out in front of them. Eternity of happiness with me, and their understanding was so much better than ours. And yet even with those stakes at play, they still chose to insult the infinite God. And as a result of that, the punishment was enormous. And so the only one capable of making payment is the God-man. The only Redeemer, the only one who can actually buy back. Because he's the only one who can give anything that's of any true worth, because God created absolutely everything else.
The God-man is not created, okay, because he's true God and true man. This unique, singular event in the history of all of existence is God taking flesh. The incarnation is the moment when all time and all eternity stood still because God became man. We need to meditate on that, eh? We need to meditate. It's a great Lenten meditation. It's that the whole thing of Lent, meditating on the eventual coming of Easter, but the sufferings of Christ and the necessity of the sufferings of Christ. And all this is because God became man. He did what? Come on. He could have just done anything else, but becoming man is beyond all of those. And when we spoke last week about the angels and the demons, and the angels, the demons themselves, it was too much for them. No, their pride was so great that they refused to accept that God could take that lower nature of man, and yet he did it. And so showing that incredible love for us, which is again why we need to meditate on the incarnation and the ramifications of that incarnation. Anything else? Good. All right. The need for redemption. All right. So let's go to original sin as a fact. Everybody got that? Where do you think I'm going to go in this next part as to writing about original sin as a fact? What are my sources for original sin as a fact?
History of humanity?
History of humanity. It's a pretty good one, isn't it? I mean, obviously the scriptures are coming to give us original sin as a fact, but the history of humanity, just human nature, is fallen, absolutely and utterly fallen. Original sin sits there, especially when we look at infants and we see how flawed they.
2-year-old.
2-year-old terrible twos. It's me. We were all two. We just don't remember it. Those naughty 2-year-olds, says the ex-2-year-old. There's actually been many a parent who've said to me that the terrible twos sometimes last a long time. Is that true? Okay. Right, so while there's no purely rational proof, of original sin, apart from revelation, there is everything in human nature and in the experiences of life to suggest that to insist upon it. Okay? While there's no purely rational proof of original sin apart from revelation, there is everything in human nature and in the experiences of life to suggest it, more so to insist upon it, because it is really part of our nature. So true is this that one of the most clear-headed thinkers has gone so far as to say that original sin is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved.
That's pretty good.
It's sort of, yeah, with theology we're talking about God, and therefore we have been working through in the last year or so, some of the theology leaves our brain having to really spread across a long train of thought in order to be able to come to, after going to 2 or 3 backing up ideas, to understand the central point of something, and then we sort of say, okay, I grasp it now in a more lucid darkness, because theology is something which is at the extension of our nature to be able to understand, because we need our senses to kick in. But when it comes to this is one part of nature, one part of theology that we can be absolutely sure of, because we see its effects at all times. The only part of Christian theology which can really be proved, says one certain theologian. His meaning, of course, is that of all truths the most evident in the inner and outer life of men, and is thus inevitably proved, even though a rational demonstration may not be formulated in metaphysical terms. If one clear demonstration cannot be made by reason alone, there is a million conditions, thoughts, emotions, feelings, situations and traditions which make the matter one that is impossible to deny. In our own lives, in the world around us, we just see it everywhere. Okay, G.K. Chesterton said the following: original sin is really original, not merely in theology, but in history. It is a thing rooted in the origins. Whatever else men have believed, they've all believed that there is something the matter with mankind. Something's wrong with us. The sense of sin has made it impossible to be natural and have no clothes, just as it has made it impossible to be natural and have no laws. Okay, we are trying very hard to get rid of that at the moment. The denial of original sin means that we can just do whatever we want and feel no shame about something. Shame is a reality. Shame is not something that is taught to us. We feel shame as part of our fallen nature. But the more we indoctrinate children, the more we try and erase the shame from their own nature. But it won't go away, it remains there. And people could say, oh, well, people used to be naked before Western civilization forced them to. Not so quickly, okay? There's not a lot of proofs to that. There are those who live in very hot climes who perhaps weren't wearing a tremendous amount, but the full going around completely naked, very rare in human existence, and very few records of some such peoples in the world. Okay? So, I'll put that little bit down by G.K. Chesterton. The sense of sin, G.K. Chesterton. The sense of sin has made it impossible to be natural and have no clothes. Just as it has made it impossible to be natural and have no laws. probably one of the things that the lunatic fringe are actually wanting at the moment is not only to be having no clothes, but also to have no laws.
No police, but they worked out that's a mistake.
That worked out well, didn't it? What could possibly go wrong? Yeah. Let's have society with no laws and no police. Everybody would just get on fine. If everybody just shows kindness, we could all just be kind.
Be nice.
Be nice, yeah.
I think it was G.K. Chesterton who wrote to a London paper. The editor had asked, what is wrong with the world? And he said, dear sir, I am.
Yeah, very, very apt. Just a bit of dose of humility. So yeah, this is where the world finds itself in at the moment. The kickback against religion is so aggressive that in the world's most progressive societies, in other words, the most westernized societies, there is this attempt not only to totally deny religion and deny God and deny a Redeemer, but an actual attempt to think that we can just have no laws and if we all just be nice, it'll be okay. And the results of this are a proof for original sin, as we saw in Seattle, Washington State, over the last 6 months. Things just got so bad that there were murders and rapes in this so-called utopia that was meant to be with these people, but no one was cleaning up their rubbish, and they couldn't. Why aren't people cleaning up our rubbish? Why isn't somebody else doing it? So the entitled society, the woke society, just becomes so irrational that in their desire to recreate a type of society, they have no laws. And without any laws, you have no foundation, you have no basis for anything other than pleasure seeking, and in the end, it is anarchy. And in anarchy, you just end up with a lot of pain. Let's take a quick break.
It's easier than moving.
I went to Canada on Saturday, Australia, I had Sunday, and there's a queue. You know, a period of time.
That's why my sister was I said, we were in college.
And they didn't have any
At least they haven't locked down the churches. They're still able to go to mass.
Yeah,
And nothing else is open around here. Hairdressers.
in Rome they have limited numbers, but they do have masses. But the craziness of it all is when the priests give communion, the priests have to be masked.
Do you know, I find that really offensive.
Yeah, and one of my friends finds it very offensive too. It's the one thing that really takes her off.
You're hiding your... I mean, Claire said when they asked her why aren't you wearing a mask, she said because I want to see, people need to see my expressions when I'm talking.
newborn babies.
Exactly.
They can't see it.
Yeah.
It's just...
My friend rang the other day about Emily. She's been pleasantly surprised with the father. You promised that he said the name of the creator of female. I went, oh no, honestly, that's perfect. And he missed out the lamb guy, he omitted that.
Yeah, what a world we live in. And the people in Hamilton are still telling you that they're not allowed to CPD all the time.
I don't know whether he does that, but I mean, he sort of breaks the rule. He's probably shrouded all the statues, right? Which, you know. They've got probably all got masks.
Yeah, probably.
I went on a bus once, that's where if I had to stay home. No, I can't. I've got a little voice saying that I can't wear them. Affects everyone.
Just get tattoos.
It's feel like in morning. But this is what Cindy said today. She wants masks to become normal so that we consider it normal. Do you have to wear the suit or you don't? Nobody else stays on?
No. I might lose my job because of it.
Well, this is what they said you might lose your job, you know.
Can you do?
Oh yeah, somebody has to send it. Somebody has to send
You might have the vaccine.
So,
I say, we're not having the vaccine, you might have it.
I'll come to that bridge maybe.
Who knows what it's doing? They don't know what they're doing. They don't know.
Also, be wary when I say from the pulpit, but we can certainly give some guidelines, especially due to. I look at it. You got to look at 3 points. One is the veracity of the vaccine. Is it going to work?
not a vaccine.
Right. So veracity. The second one is necessity. And the third one is the ethical licety. So you've got to look at 3 different points.
It's not just historical, they're actually compound. There are many babies. And I was reading the other day that babies have to be alive before you can take them. And they're put into the fridge.
Yes, it's the same like organ donations. One must be alive in order to be able to donate an organ to someone else. There must be a living human being in order to give an organ to someone. So if you put an organ donor on your driver's license, you have to be alive for that organ to go. Okay?
Maybe you're alive. You're actually alive.
You're alive.
Yeah, but you're alive, so it's, they have to actually.
They can't use it.
That's always been the case. The donor of the organ must be alive in order for their organ to be of use to someone else, and therefore you need to kill them.
Are these live?
There's a lot of ethical questions around. Okay, let's go.
I'm not down with
But I mean, it's one of those great things. Imagine being labelled like you're an anti-vaxxer. It's a label.
It's alright, we can label it. It's worse things that can label it.
But funny watching the Australian Open presentations yesterday. Novak Djokovic won the Australian Open. The lady got up to welcome everybody there, and she said, "I'm so happy now that we got back." So the crowd started booing.
Oh, good.
Like a huge portion of the crowd were booing, and social media just went, "How dare these people boo?" But it just goes to show that although the vaccine rollouts across the first world, there's widespread distrust.
I mean, everything we hear from the media and everywhere is controlled.
Absolutely, yeah.
Propaganda, and they're
Well,
saying
again, so.
Muslims won't take it.
Okay, so has everybody got this down? Because I'm going to take off these next 5 lines. I'm going to put down 5 proofs or reasons why original sin is a fact. Okay, good. All right. All right, so 1, or A, let's say. The phenomenon of shame. With reference to the physical root realities of our being. B, the traditions of ancient people. About a rebellion of men against God. So Prometheus and the Titans, to give an example in Greek mythology, in purification as requisite for the newly blessed mother of children. Again, very, very ancient world. A mother is given birth, the mother needs to come to the temple to be purified. Not only in Hebrew ancient world, but in many other traditions as well. The women had to come to be purified as if there was some sin involved in there. And the notion that man had some former spiritual existence and was put into a body prison in punishment for some primal sin. Okay, so these again are ancient traditions. So I'll write a couple of those down. In purifications as requisite. For the newly blessed mother. The notion that man had some form of spiritual existence. And was put into a body prison. and punishment. For some primal sin. C. The consciousness of miseries as punishment. Favourite idea with poets, of poets or with poets. Either one. Poets, philosophers, and others in all ancient times. From Homer, and Plato downward. There's a couple more to get up. Okay, obviously the phenomenon of shame, with reference to physical root relations of our being. So this shame that we have, which is natural to us, no matter where you are in the world, we recognise something is done wrong, there is a shame. There is also shame in the revelation of showing all of ourselves and around others. Secondly, the traditions of ancient people about a rebellion of men against God. And these are shown through things like purifications as being requisite for the newly blessed mother of children. Okay? An ancient world practice. The mother has to go and cleanse herself after giving birth. The notion that man had some form of spiritual existence, again, a very ancient religious idea, and was put into a body prison, because the body really is, in a certain way, limited, that we are extremely limited in what we're able to do, and so the spirit sort of longs to want to do more things, but is unable to do it. And that is felt or understood in ancient world religions as a punishment for some primal sin that was from the beginning, a primary. Okay, and then C, the consciousness of miseries as punishments. Okay, it's a favourite idea with poets, philosophers, and others in all ancient times. So we realise that Homer and Plato, two ancient Greek writers, so we're talking 2,500 years before our current time, 500 years before Christ, both Homer and Plato, way before Christianity, writing extensively that miseries are punishments. Punishments for what? What have we done? Okay, so there's this constant theme that runs through it, that there is some sin, some primal thing that has been done by the human race, therefore we have to suffer. And so these sufferings are just punishments for something that has gone on before. Questions on those three so far?
Why doesn't any Blessed Mother need to be purified? What has she done that's sinful?
The Blessed Mother does not need to be purified.
Sure, but other women, well, of course not, but the other women who have had births, I mean, what has she done that is sinful, that needs to be purified?
Well, this is the notion amongst people, is that
Brought sin into the world.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. If we read through the book of Genesis, that it says that, and the woman will, but because the woman has tempted man and man has fallen, therefore, as a punishment, she will have to go through the pain of childbearing. And this is part and parcel of the punishment. So does that mean every single woman, therefore, is guilty? No, we're all guilty of original sin. So this goes back as far as those very, very sands of time, is that there's just considered that we are all guilty. There needs to be purification of all of us. And as a relation of Eve, directly out of the mouth of God from those original times, there is a purification required because the woman has, her punishment is to go through that childbirth. And yeah, it's just connected to the whole idea. There isn't any direct sin. St. Thomas Aquinas says that at the heightened moment of the marital embrace, that man puts aside reason. But again, he's writing in a very theological sense there, that right at the heightened sense of marital embrace, that man does in fact for that short period of time put aside reason. But then again, the church has never said that the marital act is sinful unless it's intention, or unless it's what is going on within the soul of the person is intentional. But the marital act in itself, the church does not say is sinful at all. But the requirement of the purification is a hangover in one certain way from original sin. And all people seem to regard it. There was always this idea that women must come then and be purified. Okay, D. The various traditions of some paradise lost. Example, Elysium, the Isles of the Blessed, Atlantis, the Golden Age, etc. Okay, there are these mythologies that we're writing from, in the ancient world, writing about paradise lost. Okay, there are these different ideals of some sort of paradise that has been given away or lost. And last but not least, the consciousness common to all men of a tendency to do wrong, even in defiance of the knowledge of what is right. As St. Paul so wonderfully writes, tendency to do wrong. Even in defiance of the knowledge of what is right. All these things show that there is something the matter with mankind.
Something valuable has been lost. And it's been lost through our own fault. And therefore we are suffering because of that. A man has thrown something away and is hapless without this thing that we have thrown away. In a word, original sin is a fact. So on a slight note of divergence while you're writing some of this down, in the writings of Anne Catherine Emmerich, with which we take no theological or dogmatic teaching truth whatsoever, but always some good concepts for meditation in the writings of Anne Catherine Emmerich. She said that when she saw Adam fall, that something went out of him. Something that was actually placed in him by God at his creation. That as God molded him up and put a soul in it, God placed something special inside of Adam. And that at the moment of Adam's fall, she saw it being removed from him. Something that she said cannot be described. Something that was was certainly not material, but it was of a spiritual nature that
Sanctifying grace.
it was obviously sanctifying grace, but it was a part of this that was so real that she made actual mention of it. She said she saw him lose grace. She saw him become ugly. She saw so much of the beauty leave him and things like that. But she said there's something that was removed from him. She didn't see again in her visions of the history of the universe until Christ. Okay, and that she saw it in Christ, and that Christ could pass that on to those who were his. And so at baptism we receive, she saw a part of it, not the whole, but a part of it comes back in as the baby is baptized at that moment. So she's seeing things in a very odd, ephemeral way that are not necessarily true, but it's sort of saying, like just as I was reading here, that something valuable has been lost through man's own fault. And she saw it as this. She saw something of an incredible wealth, that it was so impressive that it could never ever be bought. It could never be understood by man as to what this thing was, because it was actually a part of what made us what we were supposed to be, truly the humans that God made us to be. And we can understand this when we think about heaven, and that we can't get into heaven unless all has been repaired within us. And then when we get to heaven, then receiving the fullness of what this back, that when we do get to heaven, that we become fully human, which we can't be in this life here. Because original sin has left us short of where we really seek to be. And we all, in our own lives, recognise I'm not where I should be. I need to be better. There's something missing in each and every one of us. Obviously, we don't have happiness that's going to stay. So we seek for that happiness. But we're actually seeking, in a certain way, for part of ourselves that has been thrown away by original sin. And it can only really be repaired, and it can only be fulfilled when we are in the presence of God, when we're back together with the one who made us for the reason of being with him. But like you asked before, God knew all this from the beginning. It's all been known. And so the redemptive work of Christ is to buy back that thing which was lost, in order so that it can be given back to us again, or we can have the opportunity to get it back again. Okay, any questions on those? Because there's still more to go on the Redeemer and on the need for redemption. Okay, I'll take that off. It's all very good. Okay. Doesn't like being pushed around this board, does it? Okay. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the book of Genesis. So, original sin. Was the failure of man. At some primal trial. The book of Genesis. Gives a detailed account of man's trial and failure. So, reason asserts that man's faculties his capacities for action in particular man's finest and noblest faculties were given to him that he might use them in the attainment of his last end. The purpose of his being. So, man's noblest faculties. Hands up if you know what man's noblest faculties are. Hands up, hands up. What are man's noblest faculties? Capacities for action. Which are the noblest ones that man has? I've only got one hand up in the whole class. 2, 3, 4. No, 4, 5. No other takers? 6. Okay, come on. We've been in the class for a long period of time now. Man's noblest faculties. Give me one of them.
Is it will?
Free will. Intellect. Reason. Okay. These are the noblest faculties, the highest, the ones that have more nobility about them because of the very thing that they can aim towards or what brings them into action. Reason asserts that man's faculties, his capacities for action, in particular his finest and noblest, so that's amongst all the others, were given to him that he might use them. So which of those faculties do we use in the attainment of his last end, the purpose of his being. So man is a creature that has a purpose. The purpose of our being is to attain our last end. In other words, to reach the final destination. That's the purpose for our existence. Which faculties do we use in order to attain our last end? Reason.
Seek the truth.
To seek the truth, okay? Free will to choose the truth. Intellect to understand the truth. Okay, these are our highest faculties. None of the other creatures, bar the angels, have these higher faculties. They are noble because they ennoble us as God's creatures. So we must use these, which is why, to chuck in a quick aside in there, drunkenness and getting stoned, therefore, are abuses of our noblest faculties, because they lower our noblest faculties, because they reduce their capacity. Free will starts to fall away when one is not truly in their right mind. One does not intellectually think things through when they're not in their right mind, and therefore one doesn't reason when they're in there. In other words, we belittle our highest, ourselves as humans, by taking an overdose or taking too much of any of these narcotics or drugs or alcohol or anything like that, okay? We just lower down, we become lower than what we ought to be as human beings. All right, intellect. Reason. By these, man was meant to attain to God and heaven. His last end. But, as always, right, there's a long one here to read out before I get you to get all that one down. Yes.
There are exceptions to some people to use their higher faculties though, right? There's some exceptions to people who have mentally impaired.
Diminished capacities, correct, yes. And therefore, God, knowing their diminished capacities, is fully understanding. And they're not an exception to the rule, they just, their eternal salvation, although they still have human nature, they're, because of the diminished capacities that they have, then God blesses them in other ways that most of us would find at first kind of strange, especially when one lacks faith. You know, if you know anybody that has a Down syndrome child, and that people of faith, they will tell you the Down syndrome child is the greatest blessing that God has given them. Okay? The world finds that appalling. Iceland celebrated the fact that they got rid of Down syndrome by aborting all possible strains of it being passed amongst their population. And they celebrated that. We no longer have those people as if they are less than us. But anybody who's had a Down syndrome child in their family recognizes how incredible they are. Because of their diminished capacities, they are incredibly childlike. Yes, they have tantrums. Yes, they get naughty. Yes, they do other things. But their love is sometimes so much stronger and not held back as ours would be. So within those things that the world sees as diminished capacities, God fills in the gaps quite easily amongst those. So you can be sure that with one who has severe mental handicap, then they have far less opportunity to sin. And with a lot less opportunity to sin, it's a lot easier to get to heaven, isn't it? Okay, so wouldn't it be good if we didn't have many opportunities to sin? But that's how God does these things. And because their lives are those in which their families have to spend more time and more personal care on them in order to be able to help them see through the way through their physical lives, then they themselves have to be a lot more introspective. And, you know, all of these things, just God knows these and He works them all out in His own way. I think we'd find that those who have mental or diminished capacities, providing they come from families that fear God, they are great, tremendous blessings. I mean, and probably all are. It's just we just don't see it that much in families whereby, let's say that the diminished capacities have been man-induced sometimes by drug use or by alcohol abuse or something like that, and it ends up being a cross and a burden towards people. But once again, nobody gets to heaven who doesn't earn it, and nobody goes to hell who doesn't deserve it. So it's not possible that someone's going to end up in hell not having deserved it. Okay? So we have that down. All right, I'm going to wrap it up with this last. There's quite a lot here. A couple of that I'd like to write down. Yeah, good. So, man exercises the faculty of intellect by acquiring rational knowledge. And he exercises free will by choosing what that knowledge evidences to him as good. Man makes that choice to achieve God therefore man had to know God and God's will. Stop. Therefore, the very first man the father of all had to represent his race. As he in a manner contained his race. He had to have some perfectly free opportunity of choosing or rejecting God. Man failed in the trial. Original sin became a fact. By original sin, the first man outraged and defiled his nature. He rejected the true end of his being. He forfeited the supernatural gifts. And helps with which the Creator provided him. Okay, so man exercises the faculty of intellect by acquiring rational knowledge, using his intellect to acquire rational knowledge. And he exercises his free will, having acquired rational knowledge, by choosing what that knowledge evidences to him as a good. It's his free will, it chooses, I'm going to choose A or B. I'm choosing this one as good and this one is not good. We're using our rational knowledge, our intellect, in order to be able to find these things out, and then we choose. I choose this as a good. To achieve God, therefore, man had to know God and God's will. Therefore, the first man, the father of all, had to represent his race, as he in a manner contained his race, because there could only be one particular test for that race. He had to have some perfectly free opportunity and Adam's opportunity had to be provided right at the beginning of his time. Okay, an opportunity to choose or reject God, and God's plan, as I said on Sunday, was one that man had to abstain. Okay, he was given the opportunity to eat all these foods, and he had to abstain from one particular food. Man, in his arrogance and his pride, decided that abstinence was not part of his Lent for the year dot. And he went for the chocolate and ice cream and cold beer was sitting out there, and he chose, it's good. He said, it's good, although I've been told to abstain from it, I know better. And therefore he rejects that good, which is the good of all, the end of all things. He rejects God himself by rejecting that which his intellect understood. Okay, he's come to know God's will. God's will was that he abstain. And he rejected that for the reasons of pride, but what was going on in his own heart and his mind at that time, what goes on in our heart and minds when we sin. Okay, we're turning our back away from that which is good. Man failed, therefore, in the trial. Original sin became a fact. And by original sin, the first man outraged and defiled his own nature, okay, because he's gone against his own nature. This intellect which acquires rational knowledge. He knows that this is God. He knows God has told him what to do and what not to do. He knows that this is God. Okay? His intellect and his rational nature have been able to work this out. But his free will, acting on those, whether it was base faculties of lust or desire or greed or hunger or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. Adam has abused, therefore, his nature. The higher faculties have given way to whatever it is. Pride has come across as the major contributor in there, and so he has defiled his nature. One test, one ring to pass them all, one test to get all mankind saved. And Adam has defiled his human nature. He has rejected the true end of his being. He's rejected God's will, okay, which he knew, and he knew so much better than any of us can. And therefore he forfeited the supernatural gifts and helps with which a Creator had provided him. And he had these incredible gifts and helps to be able to understand so much better than we have, and they've been thrown away, they've been forfeited now. They're no longer part of our nature, but in heaven, obviously, we'll be able to use those with the fullness of our humanness. Questions? Original sin is a fact.
So, if we know that original sin to be from Adam and Eve, our first parents, what's the name of the sin prior to original sin? Like when Satan sinned against God or rebelled, was that a sin or not?
Yes, Satan sinned through pride.
So,
Satan's sin was pride.
So, okay, but we can't call his sin original sin.
No, simply because this is about the salvation story of the human race. Remember that the angels, due to their nature, theirs was immediate and final because of their nature. That perfect, magnificent creature that God made them with, that intellect, that razor-sharp, high-speed computer intellect that they had, could only ever have one test, and that's the end of it for all eternity because of their knowledge. Okay, they were not hindered through the composite nature that we have as human beings with body and soul. Theirs was one decision, one final decision, and pride was their sin. Pride cometh before the fall, and they fell. So that's not what we would consider original sin, because although we are both creatures, we're a different realm of creatures, angels and men, but we share in God's image, reason, intellect and free will. But because of our composite nature of body and soul, ours is a lesser sin than theirs. But because we're talking about salvation history of the human race, and ours is not finished, the angels is. So the moment that they sinned, it's finalized for all eternity. They're either in hell or they're in heaven. And so for them, salvation history is finished. they can't earn more, or they can't earn more punishment or earn more grace. Theirs is fixed. They're in hell or they're in heaven. Ours is not finished. Okay, ours as a human race, ours is still, especially for us, we're still breathing and our hearts are still beating and we've still got our souls in our body and we are not there. So original sin is a big, big part of it for us. It doesn't have any part to do for them. That makes sense?
Yes. So, not that, because we don't understand, the reason why God created humans, because he already created spiritual beings which defiled him, so because he couldn't give them a second chance, he thought he'll give it to his next creation.
Okay, remember when we talked about God and creation and we talked about God outside of time? Nothing makes God want to do something because something has happened. It's all in there from the beginning of time. Okay, so God already knows all of that. God's plan, right from existence of God, or right within God's own existence, is that he will create rational creatures, both purely spiritual and those who are composite humans. Angels, yes, were probably created before man in terms of time, but that having been said, God gave the angels, as St. Thomas Aquinas opines, the idea of man, which they fully understood. Remember, we talked about that in the class, that angels understood about men, and they saw how much lower in the order of nature that they were, that we are below the angels. Goodness me, stupid creatures they are. Although, of course, God created them, therefore it's good. But our lack of capacity of knowledge as opposed to theirs is the length of the strait. It's a huge, vast difference in power and intellectual capabilities. And then God saying, and I will take flesh. Again, we come back to the incarnation. The whole wonder of the incarnation, that God deems before all time that he will, this is part of his plan. So, yeah, he didn't see the fall of the angels and they go, all right, I'm going to have to try option B now. Andrew?
A while ago you said we're still living in the seventh day of creation.
Yes.
So, God came to earth. Was he still resting during that time? What is meant by us living in the seventh day?
I suppose that the seventh day of creation in the book of Genesis is not, there was an evening and it was ended. And the fathers of the church regarded that as, right, that's now. We're still there now. It hasn't ended. Because God made all of those 6 days in the creation account, and at the end of each one of those days, and it was day and a night, the third day. It was day and a night, the fourth day. But when it got to the seventh day, the night was never mentioned. So in other words, it's probably a spiritual meaning more than anything else, that day is not finished until the end of time. Because that day is, man has been created on the 6th, and now we're out there on the 7th. It doesn't mean Christ is just having a big rest about the whole thing again. It's a very, very spiritual understanding of it all. Jane?
You were saying that the original sin was like because of our pride, but would you say it's also because of lack of trust? Because the way the devil put the temptation to Eve in that was like God's holding out on you.
I think in answer to your question, we can always attribute pride in some certain way to a lot of sins. It's the root of all the sins. So distrust of something implies trust of another thing. So if one has a distrust of God, one trusts themselves, so to speak, and therefore pride is the root of that. It's like the old joke about somebody talking about etymology of words, and a Greek will always find that all words come from ancient Greek. Oh no, that's from the Greek word of this. So we can always say the root of all of these sins eventually has, in some way or other, it has pride. But yes, I suppose we could say that man looked at it and rationalised perhaps, and then just, this, it's not going to work. Surely this can't work. this is better. And again, we think about things, oh, what about this? And therefore we're trusting our own opinion on certain things. And I mean, look at the scriptural example of the parents of St. John the Baptist. Okay, St. Zachary. Zachary is told that your wife will bear a son, and Zachary doesn't believe it. Oh, how can this? Oh, that's not possible. It's no chance. And Zachary is struck dumb because he doesn't trust the word of God, as opposed to Abraham. Well, Abraham laughed. Abraham was 99 years old at the time. The wife said Abraham laughed, and so his son was called He Who Laughs. As opposed to the Blessed Virgin Mary, when she's told that you shall bear a son, and she said, how will this happen when I do not know man? In other words, she's asking, I've committed my virginity to God. How is this going to come about? She doesn't say this is impossible. Zachary said, no, it's just impossible. And so Zachary lacks trust. The Blessed Virgin Mary has the trust. Abraham has the trust. And Zachary's punished for his pride, as if to say, well, I've worked out that that's not possible, so you got that the wrong way around. Yes?
That's with the original sin. It's like, you understand, like Adam's fallen, Adam and Eve are fallen. So but when they're having children, they're passing on the physical side of things. But our Lord is creating a spirit anew each time. So it's like, why, if that spirit is newly created when the miracle act happens, why is the sin of Adam, the original sin, passed on when God is creating a new soul?
Because imagine if those children were born of their parents without original sin, and their perfection would stand in need of a test, each and everybody individually once again. Otherwise they would be destined for heaven automatically. I mean, you can't give what you don't have, for starters. Adam and Eve don't have that grace of God themselves. And yes, they pass on a bodily nature to their children, but if each and every one of the children of Adam is born without original sin, then they would each and individually have to be tested, and that would be kind of hard when their parents beware. There's a snake in the garden. It's just not going to work in that case. But no, Adam's fall is because of the knowledge that he has, and Eve, both of them have this connection with God that none of their progeny are ever going to have, and therefore their understanding of all these things is superior to all who are going to come after them other than the Blessed Virgin Mary, and therefore their test has so much more weight behind it. It would just, God sees it to be, deems it to be that way, and as St. Augustine calls it, oh happy fault. The result of it all means that the incarnation takes place, and the result of it all means that our destiny and our final end is in our hands completely, 100%. God's grace is sufficient for us all to become saints.
Got one last question, sorry. One last question. So, the Garden of Eden was heaven?
No.
No.
No, because to be in heaven would be in the possession of the final end. It would be in a possession of eternal happiness. It would be in a possession of God. That is what heaven is. It is to be, it's not as if you own God, but you are in God, and therefore you possess all of that happiness and all of that goodness and everything, and therefore it would be impossible for you to sin. Because you would be like the magnet, the iron filing next to the magnet. You are one within that goodness that is God. So they were not in heaven. They were in a paradise of pleasure, but it was not heaven. They did not possess God.
Although man is created in God's image and likeness, in that sense, how does that compare to angels? Are we closer to God than the angels, or how does that work?
The angels are created in God's image and likeness.
Also, same thing.
Yes, but better than us.
But we can be closer to God than them, because we can.
Correct. Yeah, but in the final analysis, we can end up closer to God than them. And that's pretty hard when there are seraphim and cherubim who surround the throne of God, because they are the holiest of the holies. However, they are lower than the Blessed Virgin Mary. And that's why they were in awe of her when the archangel came to her. I was amazed to see this creature so perfect, absolutely perfect, and yet a human, in nature under them, in grace above them. Yes, so what is the image and likeness of God, Anthony?
Image and likeness, I don't really know it.
Okay, we did it in the class here. Somebody else?
The three powers of the soul.
Three powers of the soul, reason, intellect, and free will. That is the image and likeness of God that we share. God has created us with reason, intellect, and free will. God has created the angels with reason, intellect, and free will. So we share that with them. We just are coated in this body that really makes things a lot harder.
Clouds the whole equation.
Yes, it is. It really is.
With our sensitivities and all that, the body wants to rebel.
The body constantly kicks back against it all. The body is it's part of our lower faculties. We share bodily faculties with the brute animals.
So prayer, penance, and fasting essentially suppresses your lower faculties.
Suppresses what?
Suppresses the lower faculties and enhances
It can control. The lower faculties aren't suppressed, okay? The faculties remain, but what we do with our free will is that we direct our faculties by use of our upper faculties, our reason, our intellect, and our will. Reason about sin, reason about the rebellion of our lower faculties, which are constantly complaining. I'm hungry. I'm tired. I want pleasure. Give me this. And so there's this battle going on amongst the higher and lower faculties at all times. And as I said in my homily, either the passions control the upper faculties or the upper faculties control the passions. One leads to heaven, one leads to hell. Do you not listen on Sunday? Am I talking?
It's a real old time still.
No. That's the second time I've given that homily. Oh well, I have to do it a third time now. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Benedictio Dei omnipotentis Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti descendat super vos. Maria semper.
Amen.
Thank you.